Julian continued, gesturing loosely with one hand like he was explaining something obvious. Seeing how much those idiots would spend on something that meant nothing is the joke, he said, and now I can afford a pair of new jet skis, so, thanks to them, I guess. A faint smirk returned to his face. Who knew my underwear could fetch that high a price? Micah's jaw tightened, but Julian wasn't slowing down. You're lucky, Julian added. The guys I have as friends wanted to hide behind the curtains in the Hilton suite when I fucked you. He shrugged. I talked them out of it. Then his gaze settled fully on Micah again. But you're not giving me an apology, Julian. Micah stared at him for a long beat. The question hung there like it didn't belong in the same conversation as everything else. Julian's voice came out low. Why should I give you one? That made Micah pause. Not dramatically. Just enough for the smirk to fade a fraction, like the script he expected had stopped matching what was happening in front of him. Julian didn't raise his voice. That was the part that made it worse. He stayed leaned slightly back near the counter, like he was delivering a conclusion he'd already accepted long before Micah had even spoken. One last thing, Julian said, exhaling slowly. The nicest thing I can do for you, Micah, is keep this as a summer adventure. A faint shrug followed, like it was obvious. The real hell and nightmare would be if this lasted more than 3 months. He let out a short laugh, almost amused at his own point. People don't meet their soulmate when they're 18. Micah didn't move. Julian kept going, as if the silence meant agreement. I'm straight, he said flatly, then gestured vaguely toward Micah without precision or softness. And regardless of whatever the fuck you are, this isn't compatible with what I am. He paused just long enough to let it land. And even if you were a girl, he added, you still wouldn't be compatible. We have different values, backgrounds, expectations, financial circumstances, and different lives. Julian pushed off the counter slightly. Give it a year, he said. We'd be sick of each other, we'd be sick of the sight of each other, we'd resent each other. Another small, dismissive shake of his head. Who the fuck would want to be together for 60 years? I don't even want to wear a pair of shoes that long. The corner of his mouth lifted again. If you want happily ever after, he said, put on a fairy tale movie, or better yet read that fairy book you're so crazy about, Morris. Micah's breath caught slightly at the mention. Julian didn't stop. It wouldn't happen in real life, he said. Grown men like us don't choose to be with other guys, they choose to be with girls because that's the only way to survive in this society. Luckily, I don't have to make a choice because I'm not into guys. I'm only into desperate people who will do anything to get my attention. Being gay was illegal back when Morris was set, and it's pointless to be queer now in 1992. That landed differently in the room, not just cruel but revealing something rigid underneath it, something unexamined but absolute. Men don't love each other, Julian continued like it was a settled fact of the world. There's so much you don't know yet about the way the world works. He stepped toward the doorway now, gathering the last of the cleaned items as he spoke, voice still steady. 5 years from now, he said, you're going to be embarrassed. You'll laugh about how little this crush of yours really was, something you made up in your head. He glanced back at Micah one last time. Something I was wise enough and adult enough to shut down before it became a problem. Julian stopped just inside the threshold of the doorway, half-turned back into the room like he couldn't decide whether the conversation was even worth continuing anymore. His voice came out sharper this time. You're 18, he said. What do you know about love? What do you know about compatibility, about building a life together? He let out a short, humorless breath. You're barely old enough to see over the dashboard when you drive. Micah didn't answer. Julian's eyes stayed on him anyway, like he was forcing the point through. There's nothing going on between us, he said, and even if I had something going on with a girl around here, it would still be a waste of time. A pause. You're just a tight hole for my dick, Micah. My future is back on the mainland. I'm not going to derail my life over an 18-year-old spoiled brat who thinks that if his pulse quickens a little, it means it turns into a love affair that lasts until death do you part. Micah's face tightened, but he stayed silent. Julian stepped further into the doorway, voice flattening into something more absolute. Whatever crush you've got going on in your imagination, he said, it's all in your head, that's it. There's nothing going on between me and anyone. He gestured slightly between them, like drawing a line that had always existed. Men like us, we fuck because there's attraction, lust, or whatever you want to call it. It's not going to turn into what you've conjured up. His tone sharpened again. There are no white fences, no bobbies, and definitely no wedding rings in my future while I stay on this island. Silence pressed in for a moment after that. Julian exhaled once, already tired of the subject. I don't want to talk about this anymore, he said. Then colder. And if you bring it up again, any hint of it, you're gone from this house. He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out. The door shut behind him. And this time, the sound didn't feel like an ending to an argument. It felt like a boundary being drawn with no interest in what was on the other side. And the house went quiet in a way that didn't feel like peace, just absence. Micah stayed standing in the kitchen long after Julian had gone. The door had shut cleanly behind him, no slam, no dramatic echo, just a firm, final click that somehow made the space feel even more empty than it had before. For a few seconds, Micah didn't move at all. His mind felt strangely split. One part of him was still in the argument, replaying it in fragments like broken film, Julian's voice, the confidence in it, the way every sentence had been delivered like it wasn't just opinion but fact. Another part of him was still trying to catch up to what had just been said, like his thoughts were a few steps behind his body and couldn't quite arrive in time. You're 18. That line kept resurfacing first. Not because it was new information, it wasn't, but because of how it had been used, not as a description, not even as context, but as a limitation, a dismissal wrapped in something that sounded like logic. Micah slowly lowered his hands from where they had been held slightly tensely at his sides. He still had the black underwear in one hand. He almost forgot about it for a moment, like it had become disconnected from the rest of the situation. Then his fingers tightened again when he remembered it was still there. Julian's voice replayed again in his head. What do you know about love? Micah swallowed. That question wasn't new either, but coming from Julian, it had felt less like a question and more like a verdict. Like the answer had already been decided and Micah was just being informed of his place in it. Micah looked down at the countertop without really seeing it. Love. Compatibility. Future. Words that, until recently, had not felt like things he needed to defend. They had just existed in the background of his life the way most concepts do when you're still young enough not to interrogate them too deeply. But Julian had a way of speaking that turned everything into something measurable, something either correct or incorrect, real or imaginary, adult or childish. And Micah hated how easily part of him wanted to accept that framing just to make the discomfort stop. He pressed his tongue lightly against the inside of his cheek. No. That wasn't right. Not all of it. He replayed Julian's next line. There's nothing going on between us. That one should have been simple. But it wasn't. Because it didn't feel like it was just about attraction or lack of attraction. It felt like Julian wasn't only rejecting a relationship, he was also rewriting the past few days as something that never required meaning in the first place. Micah's chest tightened slightly. He tried to think back objectively like Julian would, like Paul had described things earlier, like everything could be categorized cleanly if you just stepped far enough back from it. The boat. The house. The party. The moments of closeness that didn't have names attached to them but still existed in memory as something tangible. The silence at breakfast. The shift in tone. The way Julian had stopped touching him. The way everything had changed without explanation and then been retroactively explained as if it had always been that way. Micah exhaled slowly through his nose. His thoughts kept trying to land on something stable. But every time they did, Julian's voice interrupted them. Men like us, it's just attraction. Micah's jaw tightened slightly. That line bothered him in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was so narrow. So final, as if everything human between people could only exist in one category or another and anything outside that was just imagination. Micah looked down at the countertop again. His reflection was faint in the polished surface, not clear enough to fully see himself, just a blur of features and posture. He thought about the word Julian had used earlier. Childish. That one stuck too. Because it wasn't just an insult, it was a framing device. A way to categorize emotional response as something that didn't need to be engaged with seriously. Micah shifted slightly where he stood. His fingers loosened around the underwear. He realized he was still holding it. The object felt wrong in his hands now, not just because it didn't belong to him, but because it represented something that didn't align with any version of the story he was trying to assemble. A prank. A joke. A lie. A performance. A humiliation. All of them layered on top of each other, none of them fully stable. And underneath all of it, something worse. The feeling that Julian didn't just deny caring. He denied that anything meaningful could exist at all between them. Micah slowly set the underwear down on the counter. Carefully. Like it might still mean something he hadn't fully understood yet. Then he stood there again. Quiet. The house around him felt different now. Not louder, not emptier, just recontextualized. Like he had been inside a place for days thinking it was one thing and only now was realizing he might not actually know what kind of place it was. His mind drifted back again to Julian's final warning. If you bring it up again, you're gone. That line should have made him angry. And it did. But underneath the anger was something else too, something more uncertain. Because for the first time, Micah realized Julian wasn't just arguing. He was setting rules. And Micah didn't know yet whether those rules were meant to protect Julian. Or erase Micah. He looked toward the hallway where Julian had disappeared. The silence held. And in it, Micah stood still, trying to figure out whether what hurt most was what Julian had said, or how easily Julian had been able to walk away after saying it. Micah went upstairs slowly, like his body had to be persuaded to move at all. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because he was physically tired, but because his thoughts were no longer staying in one place long enough to let him rest. They kept circling back, looping through Julian's voice in fragments, replaying sentences as if repetition might eventually turn them into something clearer. When he reached his room, he didn't turn on the light right away. He stood in the dimness for a moment, letting the quiet settle around him as if he was waiting for something outside himself to interrupt the noise in his head, but nothing did. So he sat down on the edge of the bed. And that's when it all started to come back in pieces. Not the argument as a whole. Just lines. Sharp ones. You're 18. You're childish. There's nothing going on between us. And then, more than the rejection itself, the way Julian framed everything around permanence. Micah leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the floor. Julian's voice replayed again. Do you honestly think you're going to be with someone forever? The question wasn't new to Micah as a concept. People joked about forever all the time. Movies, books, even casual conversations all treated it like something everyone eventually grew out of. But the way Julian said it made it feel less like skepticism and more like correction. Like Micah had been reading reality incorrectly and was now being shown the right answer. Micah exhaled slowly through his nose. Then another line surfaced. I don't even want to wear a pair of shoes that long. That one stuck in a different way. At first, Micah had almost wanted to dismiss it as arrogance or exaggeration. But the more he thought about it, the more it revealed something else about Julian, not just his opinion of relationships but his relationship to endurance itself. Micah shifted slightly, leaning back against the bed frame now, staring up toward the ceiling. Was that really how Julian saw everything? As temporary objects, temporary roles, temporary people. Micah tried to place himself inside that worldview, just to understand it properly. If everything was temporary, then nothing needed to be protected. Nothing needed to be nurtured. Nothing needed to be explained carefully, or held gently or continued longer than convenience allowed. That idea made something uneasy twist in his chest. Because it meant that what had happened between them, whatever it had been, had never needed to be handled with care in Julian's mind. It was already categorized before it even started. Micah closed his eyes briefly. Then Julian's other words returned, sharper this time. We have different values, different backgrounds, different lives. Micah opened his eyes again. That line was different from the others. It wasn't about time or romance or expectations. It was about separation. About boundaries that existed before either of them had even spoken. Micah tried to break it down logically, the way Julian would have. Different values. Different backgrounds. Different lives. He didn't fully know what Julian meant by all of it, not in detail. Julian had never really explained himself, he just stated things like they were already obvious. But Micah could still feel the intention behind it. Not just we're different, but we cannot become the same. Micah frowned slightly in the dark. Because that part didn't match what he had experienced. Not entirely. There had been moments, small ones, unspoken ones, where difference hadn't seemed to matter at all. Where Julian had been close enough that the rest of the world didn't feel relevant. Where silence between them hadn't felt like distance but like something shared. And yet Julian was now describing that entire space as if it had never been capable of existing beyond a season. Micah shifted again, pulling one knee up slightly onto the bed. The idea of summer kept coming back too. A container. A limit. A defined period where things could happen safely because they were already guaranteed to end. You're lucky, Julian had said. Lucky. Micah turned that word over in his mind. Lucky to have what? Something that was already framed as temporary. Something that was already defined as not real in the way Micah had experienced it. The contradiction sat heavily in him. Because part of him wanted to accept Julian's framing simply because it would make everything simpler. If it was just summer, then there was no loss to anticipate. No confusion to resolve. No meaning to question. Just time passing. But the other part of him resisted that completely. Because it didn't match what he felt had been happening in the space between them. Micah let out a slow breath. His thoughts drifted again to Morris. The book he had been reading. Clive and Morris choosing separation for the sake of convention, choosing what made sense externally instead of what existed internally. A sadness that didn't come from hatred but from incompatibility with the world around them. He had understood it intellectually when reading it. But now it felt closer. Less like fiction. More like a structure he was being shown from the inside. Micah stared into the dark of his room. Julian's voice layered itself over everything again. This is just summer. No happily ever after. No 60 years together. Micah swallowed. He didn't fully agree. But he also didn't fully know how to argue with something that was being presented not as a belief, but as inevitability. And that was what unsettled him most. Not the rejection. Not even the humiliation from earlier. But the certainty. Julian spoke like the future was already written. And Micah lay there in the dark, realizing he was still trying to figure out whether he had even been allowed to be part of it at all. Micah didn't fall asleep easily. He'd been lying in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling in the dark, replaying pieces of the day in uneven loops, Julian's voice, the kitchen argument, the way the house had gone quiet after everything shut down. Every time his thoughts started to settle, they circled back again. Summer, lucky, temporary. It all kept folding into itself until it stopped feeling like separate conversations and started feeling like one long argument that never actually ended. Then just after 11 he heard it. Footsteps. Not the usual kind, no casual packing, no wandering through rooms. These were direct, purposeful, moving through the house with intention. Micah sat up slightly in bed listening. A drawer opened downstairs. Closet movement. Then the distinct sound of something being pulled on, fabric shifting, a belt buckle, shoes placed firmly on the floor. Micah frowned in the dark. Another sound followed, Julian's steps again, faster now, moving through the hallway toward the front door. And then, the front door opened. A pause. A brief burst of night air. And then it closed again with a firm, controlled click. Micah got up quietly and crossed to his window without fully thinking about it, pulling the curtain just enough to look out. Headlights flashed across the driveway. Julian stepped out of the house dressed in a suit. Not casual. Not island wear. A full suit, dark, structured like he belonged somewhere more formal than this house, more organized than this island ever felt. Dress shoes hit the pavement with a steady pace. No hesitation in his movement. He didn't look back at the house. He got into the car and started the engine. Within moments, the headlights cut forward and the vehicle rolled away down the drive, disappearing into the night road that led off the property. And then there was nothing. Micah stood at the window longer than he needed to. The house behind him felt even quieter now, like it had been reset into a different state. His mind tried to catch up. A suit. At night. After everything that had happened. After the arguments, the tension, the shifting distance between them that still hadn't been named properly. Where the fuck would Julian be going? That question repeated itself, but it didn't turn into an answer, just more questions stacked underneath it. Town. A meeting. Someone else. Something business-related. Something personal. Micah didn't know enough about Julian's life off the island to attach anything concrete to it. Julian had always been like that, present in one space but sealed off in others, like there were entire parts of him that only activated elsewhere. Micah's grip on the curtain loosened slightly. He stepped back from the window. The room felt colder now, not physically, but in the way uncertainty made everything sharper. Julian leaving like that didn't fit any of the categories Micah had been given so far. Not summer. Not temporary. Not nothing serious. Because people who were only here for a season didn't usually leave the house at night in a suit like they were going somewhere that mattered. Micah sat back down on the edge of his bed again, slower this time. His thoughts didn't feel as loud now. Just different. Less emotional. More observant. He stared at the dark space in front of him, trying to place this new detail somewhere in the version of Julian he was building in his mind. And for the first time that night, the uncertainty wasn't about what Julian had said. It was about what Julian hadn't explained. The next morning felt almost unreal compared to the night before. Not because anything had been resolved, but because the island had a way of pretending nothing had happened if the sun came up bright enough. The ocean was calm, the air warm, and the small restaurant near the marina was already half filled with people moving slowly through brunch like time itself had decided to behave. Micah arrived earlier than he expected to. He hadn't really decided to come so much as found himself walking there, like staying in the house alone after Julian left the previous night had made it impossible to stay still. Everything in the house felt slightly displaced now, like the rooms were holding conversations he wasn't part of anymore. Micah didn't even know how to answer that properly, so he just showed up. Paul was already there when he arrived, sitting at a shaded table near the edge of the patio where you could see the marina beyond the low wall. He waved as soon as he saw Micah, casual, like nothing in the world had the same weight it had the night before. "Hey," Paul said, "you look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't," Micah replied. Paul nodded like that made perfect sense. "Yeah, that tracks." They ordered quickly. Mojitos for Paul, something tropical and non-alcoholic for Micah, bright colors in tall glasses, condensation already forming on the outside even before they'd fully settled into their seats. For a few minutes they didn't talk much, just small observations, the weather, the noise of boats, a couple of tourists trying to figure out the menu. But underneath it, Micah could feel it waiting. The thing he had come to say. Paul noticed it too. Eventually, he leaned back in his chair slightly. "All right," he said, "you've got that face again, what happened?" Micah hesitated. Not because he didn't want to speak, but because he didn't know where to start without sounding like everything had collapsed at once. Then he exhaled. And began. At first it came out carefully, measured, like he was trying to summarize rather than relive it. "The party wasn't what I thought it was," he said. Paul raised an eyebrow slightly but didn't interrupt. Micah continued. "Julian told his friends this story," he said, "about me." Paul's expression shifted just a little at that, interest sharpening, attention fully locking in now. Micah looked down at his glass for a moment before continuing. "He said we hooked up, that it was my first time, and then he made it into this joke." Paul didn't speak yet. Micah pushed forward, the words coming faster now that they were out. "He told them about my underwear," Micah said, "but the pair wasn't mine, not even close. Wrong size, wrong color, everything was wrong." Paul's brow furrowed slightly. Micah nodded once, as if confirming it again for himself. Black size medium, I wear white small, it wasn't even close. Paul leaned forward a bit now. Okay, he said slowly, and he told them it was yours anyway. Yeah, Micah said, and they believed it. That part seemed to land heavier than anything else so far. Paul didn't interrupt this time. Micah took a breath. And then I found out they actually paid money for it, he added. Like, a lot, 10,000, 12,000, I don't even know anymore. Paul blinked. Wait, what? Micah nodded again more firmly. He said it was a prank, Micah said, that it was all just to see how much they'd spend, like it didn't matter what it was. Paul let out a low whistle, leaning back in his chair again. Jesus, he muttered. Micah kept going now that he had started. And when I confronted him, he said, he just didn't care. He said it wasn't about me, that it was about them being stupid. Paul's face tightened slightly at that. Micah's voice lowered. And then he said I was overreacting. There was a pause. The sound of the marina filled it briefly, boats shifting, distant voices, ice clinking in glasses. Paul finally spoke. All right, he said slowly, that's not nothing. Micah looked up at him then. That was the first time Paul hadn't tried to soften it immediately. So Micah continued. And then he said everything I thought was going on between us was only in my head, he said. Like it was just summer, like it didn't mean anything and I made it up in my head. Paul rubbed his hand over his mouth briefly, thinking. Micah swallowed. He said men just do things like sleep together to scratch an itch, Micah added, and that I was acting like it was something bigger than it is. Paul exhaled through his nose. Yeah, he said quietly, that sounds like him when he's being him. Micah looked at him. Paul noticed the look and clarified slightly. Not excusing it, he added quickly, just saying I've seen that version of Julian before. That didn't make Micah feel better, but it made something in it feel more real. He hesitated, then added the last part. He told me I was lucky it was just summer, Micah said, that anything more would have been a nightmare, that it's better this way. Paul stared at him for a moment. Then he shook his head slightly. Okay, he said, yeah, that's classic Julian. Micah frowned slightly at that. Classic, he repeated. Paul sighed, taking a sip of his mojito before answering. Look, he said, setting the glass down, I've known him a long time, he's always been like that when it comes to people here. Micah's eyes narrowed slightly. Like what? Paul hesitated, choosing words carefully. Like he separates things, he said, island life, mainland life. People he keeps around, people he doesn't. Micah stayed quiet. Paul continued. And when he's in that mode, he turns everything into something he can control, he said. Jokes, stories, exaggerations makes it feel like nothing matters too much. Micah's fingers tightened slightly around his glass. So I didn't matter, he said quietly. Paul immediately shook his head. No, he said, that's not what I mean. But Micah didn't fully buy that yet. He looked down again. I don't even care about the bet anymore, Micah said after a moment, it's just how easy it was for him. Paul frowned. Easy how? Micah struggled to explain it. Like it didn't cost him anything, he said, as if he could just say things and it didn't change anything for him. Paul went quiet again. That time longer. Then he said carefully, yeah, that part's probably true. Micah looked up. Paul continued. Julian doesn't really do emotional accountability the way most people do, he said. He's not someone who sits in stuff, he moves on from it. Micah let that sit. It didn't feel like an explanation. It felt like a warning disguised as observation. The food arrived then, small plates, fruit, bread, light breakfast items, but neither of them really touched it immediately. Micah stared at his plate for a moment before speaking again. He told me I'd laugh about this later, Micah said. Paul gave a dry, almost humorless breath. Maybe you will, he said, then added quickly, seeing Micah's expression, not in the way he means. Micah didn't respond to that. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, looking out toward the marina. The sun was bright on the water. People were moving around like everything was normal. And for a moment, Micah felt something uncomfortable settle in his chest. Not heartbreak exactly, not yet. Something closer to recalibration. Like he was starting to understand that whatever had been happening between him and Julian didn't exist in the same framework he had assumed it did. And that realization didn't make it less painful. Micah sat there for a while without speaking, his fingers loosely wrapped around the glass of his virgin mojito. The condensation had already started to run down the sides, leaving cold trails across his knuckles whenever he shifted it slightly. He didn't drink it first, just stared into it like there might be something in the ice that could organize his thoughts for him. Around them, the brunch crowd moved with an easy, careless rhythm, laughter from another table, the clink of cutlery, the distant hum of boats in the marina. Everything felt normal in a way that irritated him more than it comforted him, like the world had no awareness of the shape his last 24 hours had taken. Paul didn't rush him. He just sat there, one arm resting on the table, watching Micah in that quiet way that suggested he already knew whatever was coming wasn't going to be simple. Micah finally lifted the glass, took a small sip, then set it down again like he'd forgotten what he was doing halfway through. His eyes stayed fixed on the tabletop. When he spoke, his voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It came out steady in tone, but there was something strained underneath it, like it had taken effort just to let the sentence exist in the air. "I'm in love with him, Paul." The words didn't sound dramatic when they left his mouth. That was what made them worse. They sounded factual, like something he'd been trying not to confirm for a long time and had finally run out of ways to avoid. For a moment, nothing changed around them. The restaurant kept moving, the sunlight kept hitting the water at the same angle, and someone at a nearby table laughed too loudly at something that didn't matter to Micah anymore. But at their table the air shifted. Micah didn't look up after he said it. He couldn't. His gaze stayed pinned to the glass, as if looking at Paul would make the sentence become irreversible in a different way than it already was. His throat tightened slightly and he swallowed once, like he was trying to force the feeling back down where it had come from. "I didn't," he started, then stopped, as if correcting himself mid-thought wouldn't actually help. He exhaled instead. "I didn't mean to say it like that, I just..." He trailed off. His fingers tightened around the mojito again. Paul didn't respond immediately, and that silence was heavier than any interruption would have been. Micah's mind, now that the sentence was out, started trying to undo it instantly. Not because it wasn't true, but because it suddenly felt exposed in a way that made everything else sharper. Every memory of Julian, every argument, every dismissive comment, every moment that had felt personal now felt like it was being judged under a different light. He hated how much relief there was in saying it. And he hated it even more that it didn't make anything clearer. Paul shifted slightly in his seat, leaning back a fraction, his expression no longer casual. He didn't look surprised exactly. More like he was recalibrating what he was hearing. Micah finally forced himself to look up, but only briefly, just enough to register that Paul was still there, still listening, still not laughing. That mattered more than he wanted it to. Because part of him had expected laughter. Or dismissal. Or something that would make the sentence feel less real than it already did. Micah tried to explain, his voice quiet and uncertain. "I think I was infatuated with Julian from the moment he helped untangle my pant leg from my bike chain. He was attractive, kind, attentive. And when he took me to the Hilton, I couldn't say no, not because he didn't give me a choice. He did, I just didn't want to go home even though I'd said I wanted to." He swallowed, looking down at his hands. "After we were together that first time, before he had to leave to be with his family, I just wanted to see him again. I kept thinking about him. I think I realized I was in love with him after the dance." Micah paused. "Actually, I think I already knew when you told me that he wouldn't choose me. I just didn't accept it until the dance. I think some part of me kept hopping you were wrong. The dance was when I finally understood that you weren't." Paul nodded. "It was the night of the low tire pressure after the dance," Micah continued. "I left, and Julian left me in that field overnight. It's also the night I met him, which is kind of interesting when you think about it. If Julian hadn't left me out there, I never would have met him, or at least probably not for a long time." Micah paused, his eyes dropping for a moment. "I haven't told Julian about my feelings. He's pretty adamant about no feelings, no attachments, no sentiments. I've tried to get him to admit that there's something going on between us, but he either refuses to acknowledge it, doesn't want it to turn into anything, or..." Micah looked at Paul. he really doesn't feel anything. Paul stayed quiet for another beat, letting Micah sit inside what he had just said without rushing to take it back or fix it. And in that pause, Micah became painfully aware of how long he'd been carrying it without admitting it, not just to Paul but to himself in any direct way that couldn't be explained away as something else. Paul shook his head again, sharper this time, as the thought itself irritated him more than anything else. "Damn it," he muttered, then louder, "what is it about Julian Ayers that makes everyone fall in love with him?" He looked across the table at Micah like the question was half rhetorical, half genuinely exhausted. "You're the fifth person," Paul said, "since he was 15 who fell for him." Micah didn't respond. Paul let out a short, humorless laugh. "I can't even get a girl to date me," he went on, voice rising slightly now, frustration slipping through. "And Julian, he's got everyone falling over themselves like it's nothing, and now the guys are joining in too." His hand came down on the menu. "Hard." The sound snapped against the table. Micah flinched just slightly. Paul leaned forward, jaw tight. "Is it too much to ask for just one girl to like me?" he said. "Just one, and meanwhile all of them are orbiting Julian like he's something special or unavoidable." He shook his head again, rubbing his forehead briefly as if trying to physically push the thought away. "I know it's not your fault," Paul added quickly, catching himself. "You can't help how you feel." A beat. But it didn't settle him. "This is going to end in a disaster," he said, voice dropping but getting heavier. Micah's fingers curled slightly around his glass. "I'm going to get a call in a few weeks," Paul continued. "You're going to be sitting at some train station just like the others, wailing because he decided your feelings were an inconvenience." He exhaled through his nose, eyes narrowing slightly. "And he'll just deposit you there, right next to the depot, like your luggage he's done with." Micah didn't move. Paul's expression hardened as he went on, the memory clearly still sharp. "You're not the one whose arm Beatrice used to console herself for an hour," he said, "waiting for her train, watching her cry." A pause. "And then Julian just decided he didn't want her in the house anymore because she was crying," Paul added. "So he made her leave early, that was it, that was the end of it." He leaned back again, shoulders tense, but his voice softened slightly at the end, not kinder, just more tired. "That's what I'm trying to tell you," Paul said. "This doesn't end in a conversation, it ends in removal." The noise of the restaurant filled in the space after that. But between them, the table felt smaller than it had a minute ago. Paul's expression had shifted again, less anger now, more disbelief at his own words, like he was repeating something he didn't fully want to keep saying out loud. "It's even worse when the rumors I've heard are true," he said slowly. "He doesn't even tell you he's done." Micah stayed still across from him. Paul exhaled, rubbing his thumb against the edge of the menu like he needed something physical to ground the story. "He doesn't sit you down," Paul continued. "Doesn't give you 5 reasons why you're not good enough for him or his family or whatever he decides is wrong that week." A pause. "Do you know what he does instead?" Micah didn't answer. Paul shook his head. "Under the pretense of something normal, shopping, dinner, just talking somewhere, he gets you to relax, like it's just a regular day." His voice tightened slightly. "And then he excuses himself," Paul said. "Bathroom, or he goes to pay the bill, something simple." Micah's fingers tightened slightly around his glass again. "And he doesn't come back." The words landed flat and heavy. Paul went on anyway. "He just leaves you there, no explanation, no goodbye, nothing." A beat. "Poor Beatrice," Paul added quietly. "She never even got to say goodbye to anyone properly." He swallowed once, like he was deciding whether to continue. "He took her to a restaurant," Paul said, "made it seem like he was treating her, nice dinner, normal night." Micah's gaze didn't move. Paul's jaw tightened. "And then he went to the bathroom," he said, "and never came back to the table." Silence stretched. Paul leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing as he remembered it. "The waiter brought the receipt over," he said, "and inside it was a train ticket." He looked up at Micah then, voice quieter but more direct. "That's what I'm trying to tell you," Paul said. "It's not a conversation, it's not a breakup, it's an exit strategy." He let that sit for a moment. And once he decides it's over, Paul added, you don't get to be part of the ending. Micah sat very still for a moment after Paul finished speaking, like his body had to catch up to the idea of what he had just heard. Then quietly he asked, why does he do that? Paul let out a slow breath through his nose and shook his head immediately, like the answer wasn't something he'd ever been able to fully hold onto. I don't know, he admitted. A pause. I wasn't there when he actually did it, Paul added. I never saw him do the whole abandoning thing firsthand. Micah's eyes stayed on him. Paul shifted in his seat slightly, his tone changing, less storytelling now, more memory. I was at the train station once for something else, he said, dropping my cousin off. He was visiting from Richmond, Virginia. He glanced down briefly, then back up. And I saw Beatrice there. Micah's expression tightened slightly at the name. Paul continued slower now. She was sitting on the platform crying, he said, like, really crying, not just upset, she was hysterical. A beat. I sat with her until her train came in, Paul said quietly. She couldn't even really talk properly, just kept shaking. Micah didn't speak. Paul rubbed the back of his neck, exhaling. That's the part that stuck with me, he admitted. Not Julian, not whatever he did before that, just her sitting there like that, completely wrecked in public. Silence settled for a moment. Then Paul looked back at Micah more directly. Julian's an asshole, he said plainly. A pause. Then slightly softer, like he was correcting himself mid-thought. I mean, he's a good friend, he's a terrible partner or date, whatever you want to call it. Micah's gaze dropped to the table. Paul leaned back again, frustration flickering across his face. I don't even know if he means to be the villain, he said, but he does villain behavior. That word hung there for a moment. Not dramatic, not exaggerated. Just stated like an observation he'd had to accept over time. Paul sighed, looking out toward the marina briefly before turning back. And the worst part is, he added, he acts like it's just normal, like it's how things are supposed to end. He shook his head once more. I just don't want you ending up there, Paul said quietly. Paul took a sip from his Shirley Temple, the sweetness of it at odds with the heaviness of what he'd been saying all morning. He set the glass down carefully this time, like he was trying not to spill anything, not drink, not emotion, not judgment. Do yourself a favor, Micah, he said. Micah looked up slightly, wary but listening. Paul leaned forward a bit. Get over him, he said bluntly, then, after a beat, softened it just a fraction. If you have to get under someone else to do it, fine, whatever works. I don't want to get under someone, Paul, and I don't want to get on top of someone either, Micah said quietly. I want Julian, and if I can't have Julian, I'd rather be alone. Paul studied him, realizing how serious Micah was. Julian is either attracted to me and too afraid to admit it, or he's not attracted to me at all, and he used me. But I can't really say he used me because he admitted before we even came to this island what we would be. He told me exactly what this was supposed to be. Micah looked down, his voice becoming softer. I knew the rules, I just didn't know I was going to fall for him. Paul's expression softened. And that's what makes this so damn hard, Micah continued. Because I can't even blame him for giving me something he never promised. I just wish I knew whether there was ever something more underneath it. Paul sighed. Micah, wanting Julian doesn't make you stupid. I know, Micah whispered, but it makes being around him hurt. Paul continued anyway, words coming faster now, like he was trying to build momentum before doubt caught up to him. Start spending time with other people, anyone, he said, just not him, not orbiting him all the time. He nodded toward the marina, like the whole island itself was part of the problem. There's other guys here, Paul added. Tim's a decent guy. Micah's eyes flickered slightly at the name. Paul shrugged. He's only dated one person, he said, and he treated her really well, proper, no games. A pause. Paul's tone turned more insistent, like he was trying to anchor Micah to something concrete. Tim's the kind of guy that's actually good for you, he said, even if it's temporary, even if it's just distraction or whatever. He tapped the table lightly for emphasis. He's not going to leave you at a train station, Paul said, or a bus station, or a mall, or anywhere else because he decided you're disposable. That last word lingered for a second after he said it. Paul exhaled and leaned back slightly again, looking at Micah more directly now. I'm not saying jump into something perfect, he added, a little more measured. I'm saying stop putting yourself in the path of someone who already told you exactly how he handles people. A beat. Then quieter. You don't deserve to be that person for him. Micah's face tightened first, like he was trying to hold it in, and then it just broke. He dropped his gaze quickly, but it was already too late. His breathing changed, uneven, and his hands curled slightly against the edge of the table like he needed something to hold onto that wasn't falling apart. Why doesn't he want me? Micah said, voice cracking. Why doesn't Julian want me? Paul's expression shifted immediately, whatever frustration or certainty he'd had earlier thinning out into something more careful. Micah shook his head, words coming faster now, spilling over each other. What about his private life, he said, his values, his background? He keeps saying it makes it impossible. He wiped at his face quickly, almost angry at himself for it. Impossible what? Micah said. What is so impossible that we can't even be? He stopped, inhaling sharply. He said even if I was a girl it wouldn't work, Micah continued, voice rising slightly now with desperation. So what is it? What is impossible? What's wrong with me that makes it impossible? Paul opened his mouth slightly, like he was about to interrupt but didn't. Micah leaned forward, shaking his head harder now. It's his family, right? He said. It's the homophobic family, the values, whatever that means, so why doesn't he fight for it? His voice broke again on the last word. Why doesn't he fight for me? Micah said, quieter now, like the question itself was exhausting him. He looked down at the table, breathing unevenly. I don't understand, he said. In Morris, Scudder leaves everything. He gives up his career, he leaves England, he chooses him anyway. Micah swallowed hard. He chooses love, he said, even when it's illegal, even when it costs everything. A pause. Micah's hands tightened. So why doesn't Julian do that? He asked. If it's real, why doesn't he do that? He shook his head again, tears still falling now, no longer trying to stop them. He says even if he cared it wouldn't change anything, Micah said. What doesn't change anything? What part of this is fixed? Micah looked up at Paul, searching his face as if there might finally be a different answer there. What is it that makes me something he won't choose? Paul sat back in his chair, staring into his Shirley Temple for a second like it was easier than looking at Micah directly. Then he took another sip, slow, almost absent, before speaking again. If I wasn't Julian's friend, Paul said quietly, I would tell you everything, Micah. A pause. But I am Julian's friend. Micah wiped at his face quickly, still breathing unevenly, still visibly shaken, but listening now in a different way, like he didn't have the strength to argue anymore, only to absorb. Paul's voice stayed low, more controlled than before. He doesn't want his private values and his life out there, he said. I can't tell you why, I just can't. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. But I'm saying this plainly, knowing wouldn't change anything. Micah flinched at that word. Anything. Paul continued anyway. You and him, he said, it's not going to turn into what you're hoping it turns into. Not now, not later. Even if you were a girl, it wouldn't change. Micah stared at him. That landed harder than anything else Paul had said so far. Not because it was new, but because of how final it sounded when repeated like a rule instead of an opinion. Paul leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table now, tone sharpening just a little, not cruel, but firm in a way that suggested he had already watched this pattern too many times. You're going to have to get over it, he said, whatever it is you feel. Micah's hands tightened again, but he didn't interrupt. You're 18, Paul added. I know you don't want to hear that, but it matters. A beat. In a year, Paul said, you won't even remember him the same way. Micah's eyes flickered at that, but he didn't respond. Paul kept going, as if trying to push the idea into place before emotion could resist it. He'll just be a sore spot, he said, something you learned from, something that stings less every time you look back at it. He paused, then added more quietly. You didn't mess up because you fell in love. Micah swallowed. Paul nodded once, like he was trying to make sure Micah heard him. You only mess up when you stay after you've seen who someone really is, he said. When you ignore it, when you let it keep happening. Micah looked down again, but Paul didn't stop now that he had started. When someone shows you who they are, he said, or when you find out from people they've already hurt before you believe it. A pause. And leave before it happens to you too. The words sat between them for a moment, heavier than the noise of the restaurant. Paul leaned back slightly again, voice dropping just a fraction. I don't know if Julian can help it, he said, or if he can't, but I know this much: he's not good for you. Micah's breathing was still uneven, but quieter now. Paul's expression softened a little, but only in tone, not in message. He's not good for himself either, Paul added. He's got a lot going on internally and in his life. A pause. Then more gently but still direct. You deserve someone who actually wants you back, Paul said, not someone you're trying to decode or earn or survive. He shook his head slightly. Find someone who wants what you want, he said, with the same intensity, the same direction, the same effort. Paul took one last sip of his drink, then set it down carefully. Because this, he said quietly, this thing with Julian, it's not going to become that. Micah swallowed before he spoke, like he needed to physically push the words past whatever hesitation was sitting in his throat. He looked at Paul, brows drawn tight. A few times a week, he said slowly, Julian leaves the house around 11:30 at night and doesn't come back till 3. A pause. Sometimes he leaves at noon or just before noon and then comes back later. His fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table. Why would he be dressed in a suit at 11 o'clock at night? Micah's voice sharpened, uncertainty turning into anxious speculation. Is he going to some freaky sex thing? He asked quickly, then shook his head like he regretted how it came out. Or does he have a job, like a night shift as Tim has? Paul didn't answer immediately. He just looked at Micah for a long moment, expression flattening, not angry but clearly trying to stop the conversation from running away with itself. Then he exhaled. No, Paul said, it's not a night shift. Micah's shoulders stayed tense. And no, Paul added more firmly, it's not some kind of situation like that either. A beat. Paul leaned back slightly, fingers tapping once against his glass. You're trying to make it fit into something familiar, he said. Work, sex, routine, something you can label. Micah looked down briefly, then back up. Paul continued, more steady now. Julian doesn't really live on your kind of schedule, he said. He comes and goes, that's just how he is. Micah frowned again. So he just disappears, he asked. Paul gave a small, resigned shrug. Yeah, he said, sometimes he does. A pause hung between them. Then Paul's tone softened slightly, but it stayed firm. But listen to me, he said, the important part isn't where he's going at 11:30 at night. Micah didn't respond. Paul held his gaze. It's that you're spending your time trying to solve him, he said, and there isn't a version of this where solving him helps you. Hey, Paul said quietly, shifting in his seat, come here. Micah didn't hesitate this time. He leaned forward and collapsed against Paul's chest, the movement sudden, as his body had finally decided it couldn't hold itself up anymore. The crying came harder now, less controlled, less contained, just the kind of grief that had been sitting behind his eyes for too long. Paul exhaled sharply through his nose, one hand coming up awkwardly at first before settling more firmly between Micah's shoulder blades. It's okay, he said, softer now, it's okay. Micah shook his head slightly against him, but he didn't pull away. Paul stared out past the table for a second, jaw tight, like he was trying to steady his own frustration before it came out the wrong way. Sometimes I wish, Paul said quietly, that Julian didn't come down here every summer. Micah's breathing hitched. Paul kept going anyway, voice low but honest. Every time he does, he said, someone gets pulled into it, and someone gets hurt, or everyone just sits around waiting for it to happen. A pause. It's like people already know how it ends, Paul added, they just don't know who it's going to be this time. He looked down at Micah briefly, then away again. I honestly think Julian doesn't know how to deal with people leaving, Paul said, or maybe he just doesn't let himself react. Either way, it looks the same from the outside. Micah's grip tightened slightly in his shirt. Paul let out a short, frustrated breath. Damn it, he muttered, If I were old enough to drink, this is when I'd need a stiff drink. A pause. Then his tone shifted, more practical now, cutting through the emotion because he didn't know what else to do with it. Do you want to move out of Julian's house? Paul asked. Micah didn't answer immediately. Paul pulled back just enough to look at him. You could come stay with me, he said. I've got an extra bunk in my bungalow. It's not fancy, it's makeshift, but... He exhaled. At least you wouldn't have to sit there every day staring at the guy who ripped your heart out and stomped on it. And let everyone pay 12 grand to treat it like entertainment. A beat. Paul's jaw tightened again. People are paying money for pieces of it, he added bitterly, and you're the one bleeding from Julian's pranks and bets. He softened slightly after that, his voice dropping. You don't have to stay in that house, he said, not if it's breaking you like this. Paul finished his drink in a few slow sips, like he needed the sweetness to cut through what they were talking about. He set the glass down and leaned back in his chair, exhaling. There's going to be one last dance for this month at the marina, he said. Micah's head lifted slightly at that, but his eyes were still red. Paul gestured loosely toward the water, as if the whole island was part of the same plan forming in his head. Why don't you come, he added, bring Tim's, get out, be around other people, anything other than this. A pause. Paul looked directly at him now, more earnest than before. Get over Julian, he said, and be with a guy who actually deserves you, someone who doesn't treat you like the punchline of a prank. Micah looked down again, but he was listening. Paul shook his head slightly, voice softening at the edges. You deserve better, Micah, he said, a lot better than this. A small, awkward half-smile flickered across his face as he tried to lighten it just a bit. You're a really sweet guy, he added. If I were gay or bisexual, I'd be dragging you home right now. He huffed a short laugh at himself, then immediately shook his head. Unfortunately, Paul said, I like the exact gender that seems to be actively repelled by me. That earned the smallest shift in Micah's expression, barely there but real. Paul leaned forward again, resting his forearms on the table. I haven't had a date in 9 months, he admitted. Well, not that there's a lot of options here in the off-season anyway. He glanced out toward the marina again, then back. But still, he added, Julian doesn't even have to try. Half the girls on this island fall in love with him in like 3 weeks. Paul shook his head, frustration creeping back in. What is it about him, he muttered, he drives me crazy. A pause. Then more quietly, almost to himself. And somehow he leaves wreckage everywhere he goes like it's normal. The brunch ended in a quieter way than it had begun, the kind of quiet that settles in after too much has been said and nothing is fully resolved. Paul drove with one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally tapping against it as he thought. The road back toward Julian's house cut through the island in long, familiar stretches, sunlight flashing through gaps in the trees. Micah sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, still worn down from everything that had come out over brunch. Neither of them rushed the silence. When they pulled up near the house, Paul didn't immediately turn the engine off. He just sat there for a second, looking forward. Then he spoke again, softer but more deliberate. Think about moving in with me temporarily, he said, the bungalow. A pause. If not that, Paul continued, ask Tim if he's got a place for you, somewhere you're not stuck in the middle of all this. He glanced at Micah briefly. And if you don't want to live with any guys you know or are attracted to, he added, trying to keep it practical, I can get you a really good deal at the hotel. Paul exhaled. With the situation you're in, I might be able to get the owner to give you a room for $30 a day. He nodded once, like he was ticking through options instead of emotions. Just think about it, he said, that's all. A beat. Then, as he finally cut the engine, his frustration slipped back in at the edges. And if you want me to kick Julian's ass, I will, Paul muttered, then he shook his head slightly. Why do I keep saying that? I need to actually do it. He looked over at Micah more directly now. And listen, Paul added, voice firming again, if he pranks you again or makes you feel like dirt, call me. Immediately. Any more shenanigans from Julian, he added, eyes hard on Micah, and my friendship with him is on the line. A pause. His jaw tightened. I've always wanted to punch him. Micah shook his head quickly as the car idled near Julian's house. I don't want you punching the man I love, okay, he said, still raw from everything but trying to force a kind of humor into it. Even though his beautiful, chiseled, handsome features probably deserve a good slap. He huffed a breath that almost turned into a laugh and failed halfway. I'll be the one that does it, Micah added. Paul glanced at him sideways. Micah shrugged, wiping at his face once more like he was done letting himself fall apart in front of anyone else for the day. All set, Paul said, your loss. He reached for the door handle. I have to get back to my business, Paul added. We're running a special and I want to see how many people show up. For a second, it almost sounded normal again. Almost. Outside the windshield, Julian appeared on the porch. Still watching. His gaze shifted toward Paul's car, then to Micah stepping out of it, his eyebrows lifting slightly, an expression that didn't quite reveal anything but didn't miss anything either. Paul leaned over slightly as Micah paused with one foot out of the car. Hey, Paul said casually as he just made a decision in the moment. You want to do something fun at Julian's expense? Micah hesitated. Okay, he said, unsure where this was going. That was all he got. Paul reached over and kissed him. It was quick, unexpected, more impulse than intention. Micah froze. Then pulled back immediately, eyes wide. What the fuck did you do that for? He said, voice sharp with shock and confusion. Paul didn't look particularly bothered. If anything, he looked mildly amused. Get out of the car, he said, nodding toward the house. You'll figure it out. Micah just stared at him for a second longer, still processing. Paul laughed under his breath, then tapped the steering wheel once. Go on, he said. Micah got out of the car slowly, still stunned, standing there for a beat as Paul shifted into reverse. Julian remained on the porch, watching. Paul's car rolled away without ceremony, leaving Micah standing in the driveway with too many thoughts and not enough time to sort them. Micah stopped on the bottom step of the porch, still half processing what had just happened with Paul's car disappearing down the road. Julian was already there, standing still watching him. I thought Paul was straight, Julian said first, tone flat, almost detached, like he was testing the sentence more than statting it. Micah blinked at him. Julian shook his head once, like he was dismissing the thought entirely before it could settle. But I know how it goes with men, he added. I'm just a guy who lives here. A pause. His eyes moved over Micah with a slow, assessing look. And you must be the island whore. Micah went still. The words didn't just insult him, they landed like a reset, like Julian was trying to redefine the entire space between them in one sentence. Julian didn't change his expression. How many guys are you with now? He asked. Micah stared up at him for a second, the shock turning into something sharper. You're serious, Micah said, voice low. Julian tilted his head slightly. I'm asking a question, he said. Micah took a step up onto the porch, closing the distance. That's not a question, Micah said. That's you trying to make me sound like I'm something I'm not. Julian's expression stayed controlled, almost bored. Then what are you? He asked. Micah's breath caught slightly. I'm not whatever you just called me, he said. Julian exhaled through his nose, like the answer didn't interest him. Right, he said, so just coincidence. Paul shows up, kisses you, drives off, and I'm supposed to pretend that means nothing. Micah's jaw tightened. That wasn't planned, he said. Julian's eyes narrowed a fraction. No, he said, it never is. A beat of silence stretched between them. Micah's voice came quieter now but steadier. You don't get to talk to me like that, he said, not after everything you've done. Julian's expression flickered, something unreadable passing through it for half a second, then it was gone. Everything I've done, Julian repeated. You've been here a few weeks. Micah didn't answer. Julian looked away briefly toward the yard, then back. Just answer the question, he said. How many? Micah stood there, breathing hard now, realizing that whatever this was between them had just shifted into something colder and more openly cruel than anything Paul had described. Micah felt something snap in him, less thought than impulse. A quick attempt to regain control of a conversation that had already tilted too far. He lifted his chin slightly. 8, Micah lied. There was a beat of silence. Julian's expression changed in a way Micah hadn't seen before, not dramatic but immediate. A flicker of surprise followed quickly by something tighter underneath it. Not quite anger yet, but close enough that it made the air feel sharper. Micah kept going anyway, pushing through it. "It's none of your business," he said, forcing steadiness into his voice. "You hook up with a lot of girls, you're with dozens of people a week." He stepped forward half a pace, as if that made the argument stronger. "But I can't kiss a few guys," Micah said. "Is that a double standard or something?" For a second, Julian didn't respond. Then he turned. Not slowly. Just decisively. He walked into the house without another word. The front door shut behind him with a heavy, final sound. A lock clicked. Micah froze. For a moment, he just stood there on the porch, staring at the door like it might undo what just happened if he waited long enough. Then he stepped forward and tried the handle. Locked. He jiggled it once harder. Still locked. "Julian," Micah called louder now. "Hey, open the door." Nothing. Only the quiet of the house beyond it. Micah stepped back slightly, breathing unevenly, frustration and disbelief mixing into something hotter in his chest. The porch suddenly felt too open, too exposed, like the argument had ended without finishing properly. Inside there was no movement. Just the closed door. And the realization that whatever Julian had decided in that moment, he wasn't continuing the conversation anymore. Micah stood on the porch for a moment longer than he meant to, staring at the closed front door like it might change its mind if he waited long enough. Nothing moved inside. No footsteps, no return. Just the quiet certainty of a lock clicking into place. He let out a breath that sounded more like frustration than anything else. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. Then he moved. At first it was controlled, testing the obvious: side door, back door, the wide windows along the ground floor. He walked the perimeter of the house quickly, trying each handle once, then twice in places where hope made him hesitate. Locked. 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 Every single one. He tried not to look ridiculous to himself, but the longer he went on, the more it started to feel exactly like what it was: being shut out and having nowhere else to put the feeling except movement. Eventually he stopped near the side of the house, hands on his hips, looking up at the structure like it had personally decided to reject him. "Of course," he said quietly, "of course you did." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. It wasn't even night yet. The sun was still up, warm and bright over the island, completely indifferent to what had just happened. That made it worse in a way, like nothing about this was important enough for the world to acknowledge. Micah pulled out his phone. He hesitated for half a second, then called Tim. It rang. Then clicked. "Hey Tim," Micah said quickly, trying to sound normal and failing just slightly. "It's Micah." "A beat." Then he added more bluntly, "Do you want to do something? Julian locked me out of the house." There was a pause on the other end, long enough that Micah could hear his own breathing in his ears again. Outside, the mansion sat behind him as it had already moved on. Tim pulled his car up to the curb 20 minutes after Micah called. The engine rattled slightly before settling into a steady idle. Micah was sitting on the curb outside Julian's house with his arms resting on his knees when the car arrived. He looked up and immediately noticed something. Tim looked exhausted. Not miserable. Not annoyed. Just sleepy. The kind of sleepy where a person was functioning entirely on goodwill and caffeine. Tim rolled down the window. "Hey." Micah couldn't help noticing the dark circles under his eyes. "Did I wake you up?" Tim looked away for a second. "Maybe." "Tim." "Okay, yes." Micah groaned. "You should have gone back to sleep." Tim shrugged. "You sounded upset." That answer hit Micah harder than he expected. "You need sleep. You needed a friend." Tim smiled. "I can sleep later." Micah stared at him. There was something fundamentally different about that response than anything Julian would have said. Julian would have explained why helping someone was inconvenient. Julian would have explained why sleep was more important. Julian would have explained why feelings were irrational. Tim had simply shown up. No lecture. No conditions. No games. Just showed up. Get in, Tim said. Micah climbed into the passenger seat. As they pulled away from the mansion, Micah couldn't help looking back once. The house sat silently in the distance. No sign of Julian. No sign that he cared Micah had been locked outside. No sign that he even knew Micah was leaving. Tim noticed him looking. You okay? No. Fair. They drove in silence for a few minutes. Eventually Tim glanced over. Bowling. Micah looked at him. Bowling. Yes, bowling. That's your solution. It was either bowling or miniature golf. Micah thought about it. Bowling sounds better. Exactly. 20 minutes later, they walked into the bowling alley. The place was nearly empty. A couple occupied one lane. An older man practiced by himself farther down. Otherwise, the building belonged to them. The smell of pizza, old carpeting, and bowling shoe disinfectant filled the air. Tim stretched. Micah actually felt some of the tension leaving his body. Not because his problems had gone away, but because nobody here knew who Julian was. Nobody knew about the prank. Nobody knew about the crying. Nobody knew about the summer romance that had turned into a disaster. Here he was, just another guy at a bowling alley. That felt nice. The first game started badly. For Tim. Very badly. 3 gutter balls in his first 4 throws. Micah laughed so hard he nearly dropped his ball. You're terrible. Tim pointed accusingly. I was asleep 30 minutes ago. Excuses. They're valid excuses. Micah bowled. Strike. Tim groaned. Oh, I hate you. No, you don't. No, you're right. Tim sighed dramatically. I unfortunately like you. That earned a smile. A real one. The first genuine smile Micah had managed all day. The game continued. By the end, Micah won comfortably. Tim immediately demanded a rematch. The second game went better for him. Not enough to win, but enough to preserve some dignity. Between games, they stopped at the concession counter. Tim bought 2 sodas and a large slice of pizza. Micah protested. Tim ignored him. They carried everything back to the scoring table. The pin setter swallowed the fallen pins from Game 1, and the machine whirred loudly overhead before resetting the lane. For a few minutes they simply sat and ate. Micah realized how hungry he actually was. The brunch conversation with Paul had been emotionally exhausting. He hadn't really tasted anything he'd eaten. Now the slice actually tasted like pizza, which felt surprisingly important. Tim watched him. You seem better. I am. A little. A little. Tim nodded. I'll take it. The machine finished resetting. The bright numbers flashed across the screen. Game 2 ready. Neither of them stood up immediately. Instead, they remained at the table talking. Tim took a sip of soda. Oh. What? The marina dance. Micah looked up. What about it? Tim shrugged. Did you want to go? Micah blinked. The dance. Yeah. Tim suddenly looked slightly embarrassed. Sorry I haven't asked before. Micah waited. Tim rubbed the back of his neck. I only found out about it last night. A pause. And I couldn't get hold of you. Micah laughed. That's because I was busy being emotionally destroyed. Tim winced. Right. Sorry. No, that's fair. Micah took a drink. Yeah, I'll go. Tim looked relieved. You will? Sure. Good. Micah smiled slightly. Paul told me about it at brunch. Tim immediately groaned. Of course he did. He seemed excited. Paul gets excited about everything. He also wants to punch Julian. Tim nearly choked on his soda. Still. Apparently. He has been threatening that for years. Micah laughed. The image of Paul endlessly promising to punch Julian while never actually doing it was admittedly funny. Tim shook his head. One of these days. Maybe. They sat quietly for a moment. Then Micah looked down into his soda. It sounds interesting. The dance. Yeah. Tim nodded. It usually is. Micah stared toward the lanes. I really need a distraction. His voice had grown quieter. The humor faded. Tim listened. You know, Micah continued, I just need to get out of that house. A pause. I live with a 4-year-old who throws tantrums. Tim burst out laughing. Loud enough that several people looked over. Micah couldn't help laughing too. A 4-year-old. Pretty much. I don't know. Tim wiped tears from his eyes. Most 4-year-olds don't lock people outside. Good point. So maybe 3 years old. Micah nodded. That's probably more accurate. Tim laughed again. The conversation drifted after that. To bowling, the marina, music, terrible island gossip, tourists, weather, and everything except Julian. For the first time in weeks, Micah noticed something strange. Hours were passing, and he wasn't thinking about Julian every 30 seconds. Sometimes 10 minutes would go by. Sometimes 20. Sometimes an entire bowling game. Then he'd remember. And the hurt would come back. But weaker. More distant. As if the pain couldn't survive in a room where people were genuinely trying to make him happy. The realization scared him a little. And comforted him at the same time. Because maybe Paul was wrong. Maybe getting over Julian wasn't something that happened all at once. Maybe it happened like this. One bowling game, a slice of pizza, a conversation, an afternoon, or a person showing up when they could have stayed asleep. Maybe healing wasn't dramatic. Maybe it was simply discovering that there were people who wanted to spend time with you without turning you into a joke. By the time they finished their third game, Micah had won 2 out of 3. Tim immediately accused him of cheating. Micah demanded evidence. Tim claimed he would find some. Neither could stop smiling. And for the first time since Julian had locked him out of the house, Micah felt something he hadn't expected to feel again that day. Hope. Small. Fragile. But there. The drive back to Julian's house felt very different from the drive to the bowling alley. When Tim had picked Micah up earlier, Micah had been upset, humiliated, angry, heartbroken, and locked out of the house. Now he was still hurt. Still confused. Still carrying far too many feelings concerning Julian. But he felt lighter. Not healed. Not over it. Just lighter. The afternoon sun hung low over the island as Tim's car rolled down the familiar road toward the mansion. The windows were down. Warm ocean air drifted through the vehicle. For a while neither of them said much. There wasn't an uncomfortable silence between them. It was the comfortable kind. The kind that appeared after two people had spent an entire afternoon together and no longer felt the need to fill every second with conversation. Micah rested his elbow against the door. Tim yawned. A huge yawn. The kind that made his eyes water. Micah laughed. There he is. Tim groaned. What? The guy who should be sleeping. I'll sleep eventually. You said that 3 hours ago. And it was true then. Micah shook his head. You literally got out of bed to come rescue me. Tim smiled. You sounded like you needed rescuing. The statement was so simple that it caught Micah off guard. No dramatics. No hidden meaning. Just a straightforward explanation. You needed help. I came. The end. The simplicity of it made Micah smile. The mansion eventually came into view. Tim slowed the car. The familiar house sat quietly beneath the afternoon sunlight. Nothing about it suggested the emotional chaos that seemed to follow its owner everywhere. Tim pulled into the driveway and parked. The engine clicked softly as it settled. For a moment neither moved. I had a lovely time, Tim said. Micah looked over. Tim was smiling. Not nervously. Not strategically. Just honestly. The realization made Micah's chest tighten unexpectedly. He wasn't used to people saying exactly what they meant. I did too, Micah admitted. And he meant it. The bowling had been fun. The pizza had been fun. The conversation had been fun. The entire afternoon had been surprisingly easy. No arguments, insults, manipulation, or games, just fun. Micah reached for his seatbelt. The buckle clicked. You better go home and get some rest. Tim laughed. That obvious. Very. My shift starts in a few hours anyway. Exactly. Tim nodded. You're probably right. Micah turned toward him. For a second neither spoke. The moment stretched. Not awkward. Just uncertain. Then Tim cleared his throat. "Can I kiss you?" he asked. The question surprised Micah. Not because Tim asked. Because he asked at all. There was no assumption. No taking. No pressure. Just a question. Micah felt a strange ache in his chest. Julian would never ask. Julian simply decided. Tim asked. Micah nodded. Yeah. Tim leaned over. The kiss was gentle. Nothing dramatic. Nothing overwhelming. Just warm. Brief. Respectful. The living room curtains were suddenly jerked closed inside the beach house. When they pulled apart, Tim looked almost embarrassed. Micah couldn't help smiling. Tim smiled back. Then suddenly brightened. Oh. What? I almost forgot. Tim reached underneath his seat. Micah watched curiously. A moment later, Tim produced a small metal tool. What is that? Tim held it up triumphantly. A solution. Micah laughed. A solution to what? The problem of accidentally getting locked out of houses. Micah immediately started laughing harder. Tim grinned. I'm serious. You brought me burglary equipment. It isn't burglary if you live there. I don't think that's how the law works. Tim shrugged. Details. Micah took the tool. It was surprisingly sturdy. He shook his head. You actually thought this through. I had 3 hours. You spent 3 hours planning how to help me break into my own house. Tim nodded proudly. Among other things. Micah laughed again. The sound felt good. Natural. Easy. Thank you. I figured it would be useful. It probably will be. Tim pointed toward the front porch. Now you don't have to sleep on the porch swing. That's very considerate. I know. Micah rolled his eyes. Tim grinned. The afternoon sunlight reflected off the windshield. For a moment, neither seemed eager for the conversation to end. Eventually, Micah opened the door. Warm air rushed inside. He stepped out onto the driveway. The house suddenly seemed much larger standing outside it. Much more intimidating. Tim rolled down his window. Hey. Micah turned. What? Call me tomorrow. The request sounded casual. But not completely casual. Micah smiled. Okay. Tim nodded. Good. A pause. Then he pointed at the tool. And don't get arrested. No promises. Micah. I'm kidding. Tim looked unconvinced. Mostly kidding. Micah. Micah laughed. Drive home. Tim finally smiled. See you tomorrow. Micah smiled. See you tomorrow, Tim. The engine started. A moment later, Tim's car began rolling down the driveway. Micah stood there watching. Tim lifted a hand through the open window. Micah waved back. Then the car disappeared down the road. The silence returned. The mansion stood behind him. The afternoon breeze rustled through the trees. The tool felt cool and solid in his hand. For the first time all day, Micah realized he wasn't dreading being alone quite as much. Because now, if he wanted to, he could call someone. Someone who answered, showed up, and willingly sacrificed sleep just to spend a few hours with him. The realization lingered as he turned toward the house. And despite everything that had happened, Micah found himself smiling just a little. Micah stood on the front porch for a moment, turning the small metal tool over in his hand. He couldn't help smiling. Of course Tim had thought of this. Of course, Tim had spent part of his afternoon trying to solve a problem Micah had mentioned only once. The contrast between that and everything else going on in his life was impossible to ignore. Shaking his head, Micah knelt beside the front door. It took a few tries. He wasn't exactly an expert. The first attempt did nothing. The second nearly made him drop the tool. By the third try, he felt something shift inside the lock. A small click. Micah froze. No way. He turned the handle. The door opened. A grin immediately spread across his face. Tim, you're a genius. Micah slipped inside and quietly shut the door behind him. The house was cool compared to the warm afternoon outside. For a moment he simply stood in the foyer listening. The television was on. Somewhere nearby. Living room. Micah followed the sound. As he rounded the corner, he found Julian exactly where he expected. On the couch. Watching television. One arm draped across the back cushion. A glass of iced tea sitting on the coffee table. The picture of relaxation. Micah stopped in the doorway. Julian looked over. His eyes immediately narrowed. Then his gaze moved to the front door behind Micah. Then back to Micah. A pause. You got ins. Micah tried and failed to suppress a smug smile. Yep. Julian stared at him. I locked that door. You sure did. Another pause. Julian muted the television. The room suddenly became much quieter. How? Micah considered his options. Then decided honesty was more fun. Tim gave me a tool. Julian blinked. A tool. A tool from a friend. Julian slowly sat up straighter. The look on his face was almost unbelievable. Not anger. Not annoyance. Disbelief. Tim gave you burglary tools. Micah laughed. When you say it like that, it sounds bad. It sounds bad because it is bad. He called it a solution. Julian rubbed his forehead. For the first time all day, Micah thought Julian genuinely looked exhausted. Of course he did. He was very proud of himself. I bet he was. Micah crossed his arms. The silence stretched. Julian looked back toward the television. Then back at Micah. Then finally spoke. You spent the afternoon with him. It wasn't really a question. Nope. Julian raised an eyebrow. Micah smiled. I spent the afternoon bowling. Julian gave him a look. With Tim. With Tim. A beat. Won 2 out of 3 games. Julian looked profoundly unimpressed. I don't know what you want me to do with that information. Nothing. Micah leaned against the doorway. I had fun. Something flickered across Julian's expression. Gone almost immediately. The television remained muted. The house remained quiet. For the first time since returning, Micah didn't feel desperate to fill the silence. He'd spent the afternoon around someone who actually wanted to spend time with him. It made the silence feel different. Less threatening. Julian eventually looked away first. Back toward the television. Back toward whatever show he'd been watching. Micah noticed that too. Normally he would have analyzed it. Wondered what it meant. Obsessed over every detail. Instead he simply stood there. Tired. Thinking about bowling. Thinking about pizza. Thinking about the marina dance. Thinking about how Tim had asked permission before kissing him. Finally Julian spoke without looking up. You're smiling. Micah hadn't realized he was. A little. Julian stared at the muted television. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Micah headed toward the stairs. Halfway there he stopped. Oh. Julian glanced over. What? Micah held up the tool. If you're going to lock me out again, this was probably a bad investment on your part. For a moment Julian just stared at him. Then, despite himself, the corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close enough that Micah noticed it. And that alone made the afternoon feel worthwhile. The dance arrived faster than Micah expected. For most of the afternoon he'd been telling himself it wasn't a big deal. Just a dance. Just one evening. Just something to do that didn't involve sitting around Julian's house thinking about Julian. But standing in front of the full-length mirror in his bedroom, adjusting his tie for the 4th time, Micah knew he was lying to himself. It felt like a big deal. Not because of the dance. Because it was the first thing he'd done for himself in weeks. The new suit fit perfectly. Dark charcoal. Sharp shoulders. Tailored trousers. A crisp white shirt underneath. Micah adjusted his lapel, straightened his cuffs, and took a step back from the mirror. For a moment he hardly recognized himself. He looked older. More confident. More put together than he felt. The irony wasn't lost on him. He gave the tie one final adjustment. Perfect. Good enough, he muttered. Taking a deep breath, Micah left his room and started down the staircase. The house was quiet except for the television downstairs. The familiar glow flickered across the living room walls. Julian was exactly where he'd been for most of the week. On the couch, watching television, wearing casual clothes, a t-shirt, shorts, bare feet stretched out toward the coffee table. He clearly had no intention whatsoever of attending what he would probably describe as a pointless island dance. Micah descended another step. Julian looked up. His eyes landed on Micah immediately. For a brief moment neither spoke. Micah continued down the stairs. Julian's gaze followed him. 1 second. 2. 3. Long enough that Micah noticed. Long enough that he felt suddenly self-conscious. Then Julian looked back at the television. As though nothing had happened. As though he hadn't been looking at all. Micah reached the bottom of the staircase. The silence stretched. Part of him wanted to keep walking. Another part wanted some reaction. Any reaction. Eventually, he stopped near the doorway to the living room. Julian continued watching television. Or pretending to. Micah couldn't quite tell. You don't have anything sarcastic to say, Micah asked. Julian didn't look away from the screen. About what? The suit. Julian's eyes flickered toward him briefly. Then back to the television. It's a suit. Micah rolled his eyes. Thank you for your insightful commentary. You're welcome. A pause. Micah folded his arms. You don't think it looks good? Julian sighed dramatically. I didn't say that. You didn't say anything. Julian finally muted the television. The room immediately became quieter. He looked Micah over again. Not quickly. Not carelessly. Actually looked. The jacket. The tie. The polished shoes. The way everything fit together. Then he shrugged. It looks fine. Micah stared. Fine. Fine. That's the best you've got. Julian looked mildly annoyed now. What do you want me to say? Micah opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. I don't know. Exactly. Julian grabbed the remote. You look good. The words came out like they physically hurt him. Micah blinked. Julian immediately pointed at him with the remote. Don't make a thing out of it. Despite himself, Micah smiled. Thank you. Julian unmuted the television. Conversation over. Apparently. Micah shook his head. Then headed toward the front door. His heart was beating a little faster now. Not because of Julian. Because tonight felt different. The dance. Tim. Being around people. Actually having fun. The front door opened. Warm evening air drifted inside. Just before stepping out, Micah glanced back. Julian was supposedly watching television again. Supposedly. Yet at that exact moment, Julian's eyes weren't on the screen. They were on him. The instant their gazes met, Julian looked away. Back toward the television. Back toward whatever program was playing. Micah stood there for half a second. Then smiled to himself. Whether Julian admitted it or not, he'd noticed. And for once, Micah didn't need anything more than that. He stepped outside and closed the door behind him. The dance was waiting. 15 minutes past 9, the marina was already fully alive. Music spilled out across the dockside venue, mixing with the sound of water gently hitting the posts beneath the pier. Lantern lights swayed slightly in the evening breeze, casting warm reflections across the wooden floor where people were already packed shoulder to shoulder. Somewhere near the edge of the crowd, Tim and Micah had found a pocket of space on the dance floor. Tim looked completely in his element. Not loud. Not showy. Just effortlessly steady on his feet, moving with the rhythm like he'd done it 100 times before. And he had, apparently back when he'd taken dance classes at 16 during some summer he barely talked about. Micah, on the other hand, was doing his best. Which, at the moment, meant trying not to step on Tim's shoes again. You're laughing, Micah said, half exasperated, half smiling. I'm not laughing, Tim said immediately, though he absolutely was. You aren't. I'm smiling. That's worse. Tim guided him slightly, adjusting their step without making it feel like correction. You're fine, Tim said. I am not fine. You are socially acceptable. That's not reassuring. Tim grinned. You're improving. Micah shot him a look. That sounded like something you say to a puppy. Tim shrugged. You're a very cute puppy then. Micah laughed before he could stop himself, which immediately threw off his rhythm again. See, Tim said, that's your problem, you laugh and forget you have feet. I have very functional feet. Debatable. They moved with the music again. Around them, couples spun and swayed, some clearly practiced, others just letting themselves be carried by the atmosphere. Micah caught glimpses of familiar faces from the island, people from shops, restaurants. The marina crowd, but for once no one felt like they were watching him. Or judging him. Or turning his life into a story. Tim adjusted his grip slightly, giving Micah more space instead of correcting him again. You've barely danced before, have you? Tim asked. No, Micah admitted. High school. I usually went stag, Micah said, or didn't go. Why not? Micah hesitated. Hard to find dates, he said simply. Tim nodded like that made perfect sense. Yeah, he said, high school is basically just organized social stress with bad lighting. Micah laughed again, easier this time. That's accurate. Tim spun him lightly, not dramatically, just enough to reset their steps, and Micah stumbled for half a second before catching himself. Sorry, Micah said quickly. Don't apologize, Tim said, you're allowed to be bad at dancing. I feel like there's a limit. There isn't. Micah looked at him. You're very encouraging. I try. The music shifted into something slower. Less bounce. More sway. Tim adjusted without thinking, guiding Micah into the change instead of forcing anything. The movement became easier then. Less about steps. More about simply not overthinking. Micah noticed that too. With Tim, nothing required decoding. No hidden meanings. No second guessing. No wondering what something really meant. If Tim held his hand, it meant he was guiding him through a dance. If Tim smiled, it meant he was enjoying himself. If Tim said something nice, it was just nice. Micah hadn't realized how exhausting it was to live without that simplicity until he experienced the opposite. You're thinking too hard again, Tim said. I am. Yes. Micah exhaled. Sorry. There it is again. I can't turn it off. You don't need to. Micah glanced around the dance floor. It feels weird, he admitted. Dancing. No, Micah said, not feeling tense. Tim tilted his head slightly. That's not weird, he said, that's just normal. Micah didn't respond right away. Because normal felt like something he hadn't had in a while. The music continued. The crowd moved around them. And for a few minutes, Micah stopped thinking about anything outside that circle of space. Not Julian. Not the house. Not the arguments. Just the music. Just the moment. Just Tim's steady presence keeping him from overthinking every step. Micah's attention drifted away mid-step. At first, he didn't even register why. Just a shift in focus. A pull at the edge of the room. Then he saw him. Julian. Standing out in a way Micah hated that he still noticed instantly. Not because he was doing anything dramatic, he wasn't. He was just there. On the dance floor. Moving with someone. Sandy. The woman Micah recognized immediately, the one Paul had mentioned, the one Julian had been with days ago, the one who already felt like part of a long, repeating pattern Micah was only now starting to understand. Julian looked different than he had earlier. Earlier that evening, Micah had seen him on the couch, relaxed, indifferent, almost detached from anything outside the television glow. Like the idea of a dance or people or effort belonged to a completely different world. And yet here he was. Dancing. With Sandy. Micah's steps faltered slightly. Tim noticed immediately. Hey, Tim said, steadying him gently, you okay? Micah blinked, forcing his attention back for half a second. Yeah, he said automatically. But his eyes drifted again. Back to Julian. Why was he here? That question hit first. Not jealousy, not immediately. Just confusion. Julian hadn't looked like someone who would leave the house for anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. He'd looked like someone rooted to the couch, like the world outside him was optional. So why now? Sandy moved closer to Julian on the dance floor, laughing at something he said, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as they turned with the music. Micah's stomach tightened slightly, not because of Sandy exactly but because of the ease of it. Julian looked effortless. Like the earlier version of him had never existed. Like the version that ignored him, insulted him, locked him out, or went cold without warning was just one face in a rotation. Micah swallowed. Maybe Sandy had convinced him. That thought arrived more slowly. It made sense in a way that didn't feel good. Sandy had always seemed bold enough for that kind of thing, someone who could walk up to Julian and pull him out of his own inertia, even for a night. Micah looked away again. Back toward Tim. Tim was still watching him. Not Julian. Just him. You saw him, Tim said quietly. It wasn't a question. Micah nodded once. Tim didn't follow his gaze. Didn't look over. Just kept his focus on Micah. You want to leave? Tim asked. Micah hesitated. His eyes flicked back one more time before returning to Tim. Julian was still dancing. Still not looking in his direction. Still completely unaware or uninterested in the fact that Micah was even there. Micah shook his head slightly. No, he said. A pause. I'm fine. Tim studied him for a moment, then nodded. Okay, he said simply, then stay with me. And they kept moving with the music. But something had shifted slightly in Micah's chest. Not a collapse. Not a break. Just a reminder. That Julian existed in every space Micah tried to feel safe in. And that didn't disappear just because the music was loud. The music was still thumping in the background when Micah finally pulled back from Tim slightly, the crowd moving around them in waves of color and sound. His energy had shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough that Tim noticed immediately. I'm tired, Micah said an hour later, a little breathless, like the words had been sitting in him for a while before he finally gave them shape. I think I'm going home. Tim blinked. Already? Micah nodded. The honesty of it surprised even him. A few minutes ago he'd been trying to stay in the moment, now it felt like something in him had quietly run out. Tim glanced around the dance floor once, then back to him. You okay to drive? Micah nodded again. Yeah, I brought Paul's car here anyway, I'll just take it back. Tim frowned slightly. You sure I can? I'm fine, Micah said gently, cutting in before Tim could offer more. Not because he didn't appreciate it. Because he did. And if he let Tim keep offering, he might not leave at all. I think I just ate too much earlier, Micah added with a weak half-smile, bowling pizza revenge. That got a small laugh out of Tim. Fair. The music swelled behind them as another couple spun past, completely unaware of anything outside their own orbit. Micah stepped in first. He pulled Tim into a hug. It was quick at first, then held a second longer than expected. Tim hugged him back without hesitation, steady, warm, grounding in a way Micah hadn't realized he'd started to rely on. I'll call you tomorrow, Micah said. Yeah, Tim replied immediately, do that. Micah pulled back just enough to look at him. Thanks so much for bringing me, he said, and for bowling I had an amazing time. Tim smiled. Me too. A beat passed. The kind that usually gets filled with awkwardness. But neither of them rushed it. Micah exhaled slowly, like he was making a decision he didn't want to overthink. Then he leaned in. And kissed Tim. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't confused. It was simple. Direct. A clear ending to a good night. Unbeknownst to Tim and Micah, Julian was still dancing with Sandy. He could see Micah nearby, talking with Tim, and when Micah leaned in and kissed Tim, Julian saw the entire thing. When Micah pulled back, Tim didn't speak right away. His expression flickered, surprise first, then something softer settling in behind it. Okay, Tim said finally a little quietly. Micah gave him a small, slightly embarrassed smile. Okay. Okay, Tim repeated, then nodded once like he'd accepted something without needing to define it out loud. Micah stepped back. Drive safe, Tim added. I will. Tim watched him for a second longer, then gave a small wave. Micah turned and began walking away from the dance floor, weaving through the crowd toward the exit. Outside, the night air felt cooler. Quieter. The sound of the music faded behind him as he stepped toward the parking area, keys in hand, already feeling the weight of the day settle into something calmer. And for the first time in a long time, Micah didn't feel like he was walking back toward uncertainty. Just toward home. On the path out toward the parking area, Micah kept his head slightly down, still carrying the lingering buzz of the night, the music fading behind him, the warmth of the crowd thinning into open air. He wasn't fully focused on where he was going. So when he bumped lightly into someone, it startled him. "Sorry, excuse me," Micah said, quickly stepping back. The other person steadied slightly but didn't seem bothered. Micah looked up. It was Sam. The same guy from earlier, the one who had returned the underwear, the man who had spoken to him in Julian's house like everything was a bit too loud and too complicated for Summer. "Oh," Micah said, blinking. "Hey." Sam recognized him immediately. "Right," Sam said. "Micah." Micah nodded once. "Yeah." A brief pause passed between them as the music from the dance pulsed faintly in the background. Sam studied him for a second, not in a judgmental way, more like noticing something was off. "You look a little pale," Sam said. "You feeling all right?" Micah forced a small smile. "I missed you when I was at the beach house earlier," Sam said. "I stopped by to check in on you and make sure you were doing okay, especially after that heartless bastard and all of Julian's friends acting like assholes. Julian was home upstairs but you weren't there. Sorry I missed you." "I'm okay," Micah said, "just going to go home and, go to bed." He shifted the car keys in his hand as they grounded him. Sam nodded, slowly watching Julian.